Hi, this is Mark Middleberg, and I'm with you here coming from CCN, and we're at the live broadcast of the Great Resurrection Debate. We're broadcasting from Bethel College in northern Indiana, and right behind me is the auditorium where we're going to go live to the debate in just a couple of minutes. But I just want to say we're thrilled to have churches from all over North America, up in Canada, all the way to Florida and California, everywhere in between. We've got over 2,000 churches that we're broadcasting to today, and we're so glad that you've joined us. You know, I cannot think of a more important topic for us to be discussing today, especially during this Easter season, than this question of the evidence for or against the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. You know, many people feel that this is the pivotal issue on which historic Christianity rises or falls. It's been called the linchpin of Christianity, the cornerstone, or the epicenter of the faith. Dr. Terry Meathy says it like this. He says, "This is the most important question regarding the claims of the Christian faith. But while many Christians sort of assume that Jesus really raised from the dead, the National Religious News Service reports that the leaders of the group called the Jesus Seminar in recent times have concluded, quote, that there is no evidence for the Easter resurrection or that it was a physical reality. And they say that the story of the historical Jesus ended with his death on the cross and the decay of his body." John Dominic Crossan, a scholar at DePaul University in Chicago, goes even further and says that the tomb of Jesus was empty because his body was already being devoured by wild dogs. Well, these are serious charges, and according to theologian Gerald O'Collins, he says, in a profound sense, Christianity without the resurrection is not simply Christianity without its final chapter. It's not Christianity at all. The Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, "If Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless, and you are still under condemnation for your sins. If we have hope in Christ only in this life, we are the most miserable people in the world." So again, obviously, this is a vitally important issue. Did Jesus really rise from the dead or not? And as you can guess, there are strong opinions on both sides, and we're going to hear two of those opinions tonight. So I just want to challenge you. Really engage your mind. Listen and weigh what you hear, and then apply it in your life in the days ahead. Now, before we go into the debate and begin formally, let me just give you a little overview of the schedule. Midway through, we're going to take a short stretch break. Now, don't try to go real far because it's going to be real quick, but it's a chance at least to stand up and stretch. During that time, if you'd like to fax or email questions, you can do that and try to get those in by the end of that break. And then during a short Q&A time, we'll ask our two debaters to respond to the most asked questions. Now, I'll be back again at the very end to close out our debate, so hold on for that, and I'll tell you about how you can get a DVD of tonight's broadcast at that time. Now, our moderator for tonight's debate is Dr. David Aikman. Dr. Aikman has an incredible career. He's an award-winning print and broadcast journalist who worked for 23 years with the Time magazine organization, and during that time covered almost all the major events happening around the globe. He's also an author of numerous books, and he is the foreign policy consultant in a firm based in Washington, D.C. We are so honored to have Dr. Aikman with us tonight, moderating the debate. And at this point, we're going to go live into the auditorium, and would you welcome with me Dr. Aikman.
Welcome to Bethel College and the Great Resurrection Debate here on March 20th, Palm Sunday, 2005. This is a debate on the historicity of the resurrection, or whether Jesus Christ bodily rose from the dead or not. We have two very distinguished debaters here tonight, and I'm going to introduce them, and then they are going to come out on stage, and you, the audience, will be free to applause at that point. Our first debater is Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig earned a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, England, before taking a doctorate in theology from the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München, Germany. In Germany, Dr. Craig was a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung and wrote on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. He also spent several years at the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven in Belgium and is currently a research professor at Talbot School of Theology of La Mirada, California. Our second debater is Bishop John Shelby Spong. Bishop John Shelby Spong is a renowned author and speaker. He is the retired bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark, where he served for 24 years. Dr. Spong has received numerous honors, including being named Quarter Centenary Scholar by Emmanuel College, Cambridge University, and Humanist of the Year in 1999. The Protestant Episcopal Theological Seminary in Virginia and St. Paul's College have conferred on him the Doctor of Divinity degrees and Muhlenberg University a Doctor of Humane Letters degree. He has been Scholar in Residence at Christ Church, Oxford, and is a Fellow of St. Daniel's Library in Wales. Will you please welcome our two debaters, Dr. Craig and Bishop John Shelby Spong.
Good time. Okay.
Now, for our television audience and for the studio audience, I'm going to explain the rules of the debate. Each debater is going to have an opening statement of 15 minutes. Each debater is then going to have a rebuttal of 10 minutes, and then there will be a break. There will be a second rebuttal after the break by both speakers, and then a question and answer period. We will be collecting questions that are emailed in and provided by members of the audience during the break period or even beforehand, and I will select questions for the speakers from those that are given to me. Each question will be given to a speaker, and he will have the chance to speak for 1 minute in response, and so will the other debater. We will then have a closing statement by each debater of 5 minutes, and I will make a concluding statement, and then we will finish the debate. I do ask all of you in the studio audience to refrain from any kind of applause except when you are told to do so, which will be at the end. This is not a canned comedy show, but you must understand that we must be very, very fair to each of these speakers, and we must not show any partisanship while they are actually speaking. You may, of course, present your applause for the whole presentation at the end of the debate. I'm also going to be rather strict on the time allotted to each of the debaters, and although I'm quite sure that each of them will be honoring the time they have been given, if there is any lapse in this, I shall politely but firmly ask the person to finish speaking. We'll do it in a reasonably gentlemanly way, I hope. This is a very important debate, and I'm sure you don't need to be reminded of why it's rather significant at this time of year, and it'll give us a lot to think about. I would like to invite right now the opening statement by Dr. William Lane Craig.
Good evening. I want to begin by thanking Bethel College and CCN for hosting this debate on the meaning of the resurrection. And I also want to say that I consider it a real privilege to be sharing the podium tonight with so influential a churchman as Bishop Spong. My main contention in tonight's debate is that Jesus' resurrection was a real historical event, and therefore meaningful for us today. So in my opening speech, I want to outline a case for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. Now, I'm going to be giving you a lot of historical information, so hold on to your hats. A historical argument for Jesus' resurrection involves two steps. First, determine what are the facts to be explained, and second, determine what is the best explanation of those facts. First, what are the facts to be explained? In order to answer this question, it's important to say something about our sources for the historical Jesus. Our principal sources for the life of Jesus consist of documents written within a generation after his death, which were later collected by the church and put into one volume called the New Testament. When historians investigate Jesus' life, they're not treating the New Testament as a wholly inspired book. They're not even assuming that the New Testament is generally reliable. The historian expects to find errors and inconsistencies in even his most reliable sources. So the historian isn't presupposing that the New Testament documents are reliable. Rather, he's arguing that in the case of a specific event, there are good reasons to think that the documents are reliable on that score. So, when we come to what these documents have to say about the resurrection, the question is, what historical facts about this event can we reliably recover from the documents? Now, it might come as something of a surprise to you that today the relevant facts are largely agreed upon by New Testament critics. There has been a revolution in New Testament scholarship concerning the resurrection over the last half-century. Back in the 1940s and 50s, it was widely believed that the story of Jesus' empty tomb was a legend shaped by the theology of the early church, which arose many decades after Jesus was dead and gone. The post-mortem appearances of Jesus were thought to have been hallucinations brought on by the disciples' fervent faith in Jesus. And the disciples' belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead was taken to be the result of the profound impact Jesus had had upon his disciples during his life. Today, these positions have been largely abandoned within the scholarly community. Those who still cling to the older opinions represent the radical fringe of contemporary New Testament scholarship. Instead, today, the majority of scholars affirm the following three facts about what happened following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered empty by a group of his women followers. Two, on multiple occasions, various individuals and groups experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And three, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. What are some of the reasons that have persuaded most scholars to think that the documents are accurate with respect to these three facts? Let me simply mention a few of the reasons. First, with respect to Jesus' empty tomb, most scholars have been convinced on the basis of reasons like the following three. Reason number one, the empty tomb story is part of Mark's very old source material. Behind Mark's story of Jesus' passion lies an earlier source, which included the story of the women's discovery of his empty tomb. Mark is the earliest of our Gospels, so his source must be even earlier still. In fact, the commentator Rudolf Pesch dates this source to within 7 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Contrast this with the sources for Roman and Greek history, which are usually removed 1 or 2 generations or even centuries from the events that they record. For example, the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch over 400 years after Alexander's death, and yet classical historians consider them still to be trustworthy. According to A.N. Sherwin-White in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, even 2 generations is too short a time span to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts. Thus, the extraordinarily early date of Mark's passion source effectively rules out the hypothesis that the story of the empty tomb is a late developing legend, as critics used to think. Reason number 2, Mark's account of the empty tomb is multiply and independently attested by other sources. One of the most important criteria used by historians is multiple independent attestation. If an event in Jesus' life is attested by at least 2 independent sources, one of which is early, then the event is likely to be historical. As New Testament critic Marcus Borg explains, the logic is straightforward. If a tradition appears in an early source and in another independent source, then not only is it early, but it is also unlikely to have been made up. In the case of the empty tomb, we have not only Mark's early passion source, but also independent sources used by Matthew and John. The empty tomb is also mentioned in the early sermons, in the Acts of the Apostles, and implied by Paul in his letter to the church in Corinth. Thus, we have early, multiple, independent attestation of the fact of the empty tomb, one of the most important indications of historicity. Reason number 3, the tomb was discovered empty by women. In a patriarchal society, like first century Palestine, where the word of a woman was looked down upon, it's remarkable that it is women who are the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples, like Peter and John, discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women, rather than men, who are the chief witnesses to the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what, for them, was an awkward and embarrassing fact. In my book, I list 10 lines of evidence in support of the empty tomb, but I think enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist on the resurrection, and I quote, "By far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb," end quote. As for that second fact, Jesus' post-mortem appearances, this fact is almost universally acknowledged among New Testament scholars for the following 2 reasons. Reason number 1, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' appearances, which is quoted by Paul, guarantees that such appearances occurred. In his first letter to the church in Corinth, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. This information has been dated to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. It mentions the appearances to Peter and to the 12 disciples. Paul then goes on to say, then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." According to his letter to the churches of Galatia, Paul was in Jerusalem within 6 years of Jesus' crucifixion and spent 2 weeks with Peter and James. Given the early date of this information, as well as Paul's personal acquaintance with the people involved, such appearances can't be written off as legends. Reason number 2, the appearance narratives in the Gospels provide multiple, independent attestation of the appearances. For example, the appearance to Peter is attested by Luke and Paul. The appearance to the 12 is attested by Luke, John, and Paul. And the appearance to the women is attested by Matthew and John. The appearance narratives span such a breadth of independent sources that it cannot be reasonably denied that the earliest disciples did have such experiences. Even the skeptical critic Gert Ludemann therefore concludes, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ," end quote. Finally, the origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, their leader was dead, and Jews had no idea of a dying, much less rising, Messiah. Jewish messianic expectations included no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. Number two, according to Old Testament law, Jesus' execution exposed him as a heretic, a man literally accursed by God. And three, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. Bishop Spong himself writes in his book, The Easter Moment, that something big and powerful actually happened to produce this change. Indeed, I've rarely seen a more powerful statement of this point than Bishop Spong's. He points out that the lives of both Jesus' disciples and his family were radically transformed, that Sunday became the new holy day rather than the Jewish Sabbath, that God was reconceived to be not just one person, but to include Christ, that the content of the gospel message became Jesus himself, that Jerusalem became the center of Christianity, and that leading members of the anti-Christian religious establishment became followers of Christ. All of this is historical data, he concludes, that begs for an adequate explanation. But what was that big and powerful something, if not the resurrection itself, as the disciples proclaimed? As the eminent British scholar N.T. Wright has written, without the resurrection, there is a gaping hole in the middle of first-century history that nothing else can plug. That is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. In summary, then, these three facts are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars who have written on the subject: Jesus' empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief. That brings us then to the second step of our argument, that the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. This was, of course, the explanation given by the eyewitnesses themselves, and I can think of no better explanation. Down through history, various naturalistic alternatives have been proposed, such as the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so on. In the judgment of contemporary scholarship, however, none of these naturalistic theories has managed to provide a plausible explanation of the facts. Does this mean, therefore, that most scholars accept the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation? No, it does not. For in order to accept the explanation, God raised Jesus from the dead, you must be prepared to affirm that a miracle has occurred. And many historians feel that they cannot do that. Not that they deny the possibility of miracles, but they feel that in their capacity as professional historians, it's against the rules, so to speak, to appeal to miraculous explanations. To say that some event is a miracle is to make a philosophical judgment, not a historical judgment. And so, as historians, they can offer no explanation. But as long as we're willing to think philosophically about history, there's nothing to bar us from drawing the inference God raised Jesus from the dead. If our minds and hearts are open to God's existence, then we will be open to miracles as well. As the Australian philosopher Peter Slezak has nicely put it, for a God who can make the whole of the universe, the odd resurrection should be child's play. Indeed, today the rational man can hardly be blamed if he concludes that on that first Easter morning, a divine miracle occurred.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. Bishop Spong.
Thank you, sir. Also, I would like to thank Bethel College. I do a lot of lecturing around the world, and I don't know any place that I've ever been more warmly and more graciously welcomed. So I thank you for that. I'm also pleased to thank the Church Communications Network, and it's a privilege for me to meet Dr. Craig, who has had such a distinguished career and who can quote me so well. I find the title of this debate to be a bit misleading. I'm a Christian. I served my church first as a priest and then as a bishop for almost 50 years. I do not believe it is possible to be a Christian apart from the reality of the resurrection. I assume that my colleague, Dr. Craig, stands united with me on that proposition. The reality of the resurrection is essential. But the reality of the resurrection is not the substance of our discussion. Any attempt to suggest that it is would be a violation of both of our integrity and the integrity of Bethel College. I suspect that the differences that will appear between Dr. Craig and myself will not be about the centrality or the reality of the resurrection, but on the factual accuracy of the biblical accounts of the Easter moment, even of the way the resurrection is or can be understood. Ultimately, the most important thing that we need to establish is that it is available and eternal in every generation, not just an historical event that happened some 2,000 years ago. I am not a biblical literalist, though I was one for many years, and my mother died a strict biblical fundamentalist. I'm still very thankful that I had that upbringing, though I have abandoned that point of view. But that evangelical upbringing gave me an insatiable desire to study the Scriptures. And that study has dominated my life for my entire career. Not a day goes by that I do not wrestle with the words of the Bible. The resurrection narratives have been a primary focus of that study for me. The last book I wrote on the resurrection, not the one that Dr. Craig quoted, was revelatory in its title. I submitted that manuscript to my publisher, HarperCollins, with the working title, Resurrection, Myth, and Reality. HarperCollins changed my title and published it under the title, Resurrection, Myth, or Reality. I think it has to be both. They wanted to suggest that I believed that it could be one or the other. Harper has invested a lot of money in making me controversial, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose on their investment. But let me go over those two things. The reality. Yes, the resurrection's real. And Dr. Craig pointed to some of the things that I still hold quite firmly. The resurrection was an event of such power and such life-changing energy that the disciples who had all abandoned Jesus at the time of his arrest and had forsaken him and fled were reconstituted. And not just reconstituted, but quite willing to give their lives for the reality of that experience. There's enormous power in that. Secondly, we must not forget that these are Jewish men. And in the Jewish tradition, the most sacred part of the whole tradition was that God was one. Nothing could stand in the presence of God. And yet there was something about whatever the resurrection was that was so powerful and so overwhelming that these Jewish men had to expand their definition of God so that it was big enough to include Jesus of Nazareth. And they were no longer able to look at Jesus of Nazareth without seeing him as part of who God is. And thirdly, they created a new holy day. Now, for those of us who have been in active ministry with congregations, we know how serious and important that is. When I was the Bishop of Newark, I had churches that I was quite sure that if the Lord God, God's self, had appeared before those congregations and said, folks, I want you to change the Sunday hour from 10 to 10:30 beginning next week, some in those congregations would say, but Lord, that's not the way we do it in this church. Changing people's worship traditions is a powerful, powerful argument. But something happened that was associated with the first day of the week that created, certainly within one generation, a new holy day that stood side by side with Jewish Sabbath. And then when the Christian faith finally moved out of its Jewish orbit and into the Mediterranean Gentile world, the Jewish Sabbath was dropped, and the Christian Sunday became the holy day of the Western world. It's still interesting to me that we put Jewish Sabbath and Christian Sunday together to create the weekend, which we still observe whether we are religious or not. So there is reality to the resurrection experience that I would not want anybody to think that I would doubt or question. But a God experience has to be put into human words. And that's where mythology enters. And by mythology, I mean that human beings do not speak a God language. We only speak a human language. So whenever we have a God experience, we have to put that experience into our human created frame of reference. And our language is simply not big enough to capture the wonder, the mystery, the reality of that inbreaking eternity. And so what do? We have to develop expansive language. We have to get it beyond our abilities. And that's what I see over and over again in the biblical narratives. I take those narratives seriously. I do not take them literally. But we need to face the fact that the inadequacy of all human language is something we must deal with. The only way a 21st century person can be a Christian is to be able to put the experience of God into 21st century language. Let me illustrate that for just a moment. If you witnessed an epileptic seizure in the 1st century, and if you witnessed an epileptic seizure in the 21st century, the reality that you would experience would be identical. But if you were to read the explanation that 1st century people gave to that epileptic seizure, and the explanation that 21st century people gave to that epileptic seizure, you would recognize that language is time-bound and time-warped. And if you ever take the language of a human explanation and say that this is the ultimate literal truth, it seems to me you have violated the eternity of that experience. Let me look at the language of the resurrection narratives for just a bit. And to tell you, if you're going to literalize the stories, this fanciful language gets in the way of a lot of modern people. Matthew says there was an earthquake when Jesus died, and another earthquake when the resurrection occurred. Were those literal earthquakes, or was he speaking poetically? The Gospels say that at 12 noon on the first Good Friday, darkness covered the whole earth until 3 o'clock. Was that a literal darkness, perhaps an eclipse of the sun? Or was that a poetic reference to what it meant to watch this love of God die? The Gospels say that when Jesus died, the veil in the temple was split from top to bottom. You need to understand what that veil meant. It separated the holy place where people could gather from the Holy of Holies, which was thought to be God's dwelling place. And the only person that could go into the Holy of Holies was the high priest. And he could go only once a year and after enormous purification rites. That veil separated human life from the ultimate presence of God. Was that a literal splitting? Was that a poetic way they were trying to describe what the meaning of the death of Jesus was? Matthew says in a gospel I heard read this morning at St. James Cathedral here in South Bend, that when the death of Jesus occurred, the earthquake opened up the graves. And people who had been long dead came up out of their graves and walked around in Jerusalem and were seen by people. Is that literal? Or is that poetic language? And then we're told that angels can ride on the wings of the wind to announce the resurrection, that they have the power to strike guards and put them in a state of unconscious stupor, and that they can roll back the stone, and that they can talk to the women, I presume in Aramaic, since that was the only language the women spoke. Can these descriptions of the resurrection that include all of these poetic symbols, could they still be real? Is there something behind that language that cannot be denied? And is the story of a dead man walking out of a tomb, presumably 3 days after his death, physically resuscitated? Is that literal language? Or is that language of people who are so transformed by the power of the living God that they have to create human language to communicate that experience? The second thing I think we need to look at when we look at those narratives is that they disagree on almost every detail. Let me walk you through them. Who went to the tomb at dawn on the first day of the week? We have 4 Gospels. We have 4 different lists. The only consistent figure in all 4 of them is Mary Magdalene. Did the women see the risen Lord in the garden at dawn on the first day of the week? No, says Mark. Yes, says Matthew. No, says Luke. Yes, says John. Even my friend Jerry Falwell can't make those fit together. It just won't work. It's a contradiction. Where were the disciples when they had this life-changing, in-breaking experience of resurrected power? Where were they? The Gospels don't even agree with that. Mark says it will be in Galilee. Matthew says it was in Galilee. Luke says it was never in Galilee. It was always in Jerusalem in the immediate environs. And John says it was in Jerusalem first. But then when he writes an appendix to his gospel in chapter 21, he makes a Galilean appearance much, much later. Indeed, it's hard to date the time, perhaps even years. Was the risen Christ physical? Well, Paul says he appeared. He never describes that appearance, so you don't get any data as to whether it was physical or not. Mark never describes the risen Christ appearing to anyone. Oh, there's a later addition to Mark that does, but in the authentic part of Mark's gospel, there is no appearance of the risen Christ to anyone. That's our earliest gospel. Matthew, who sort of seems to say it was a physical Jesus, that the women grabbed the feet of him in the garden on the morning of the resurrection. But then when he tells the story of Jesus appearing to the disciples, it's distinctly not physical. Jesus seems to come out of the heavens, clothed with the authority of the Son of Man. And he comes to give the disciples only their marching orders. Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel. It's only when you get to Luke and John, the last 2 Gospels, I would date them in the late 9th decade and the mid-10th decade. It's only in these latter Gospels that you begin to get appearances and empty tombs and all of the physical part of that resurrection story. But even here, Luke describes this Christ as having the ability to materialize on the road to Emmaus and to dematerialize after the breaking of the bread. That doesn't sound like any physicality that I understand. And John has the Christ have the ability to walk into a locked and barred upper room and still offer his physical wounds to Thomas to print, to feel, to touch, physicality. Were they trying to determine that the experience that they were having after the death of Jesus was in fact an experience of a living Christ who was identical with that Jesus? And that's the language that they used to describe it. There's no doubt in my mind that any of us would be here today talking about the resurrection if there weren't something real about it. But I think we've got to begin to open the Scriptures to scholarship, open them to a new understanding, so that we don't have to take 21st century minds and twist them into first century pretzels in order to be disciples of Jesus of Nazareth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Spong. We now have 10 minutes for the first rebuttal by Dr. Craig.
Thank you, Bishop Spong, for those thoughtful remarks and criticisms. In this speech, I'd like to re-examine the case that I presented and see how it stands up in light of Bishop Spong's criticisms. Now, you'll recall that my argument has two steps. First step is to determine the facts to be explained, and here I listed some of the reasons that have led most scholars to agree with the facts of Jesus' empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Now here, Dr. Spong suggests that these narratives should be read as myths, not literally, that it's a mistake to think of them as literal. Well, now, I believe this is really a straw man. Nobody takes every passage in the Bible literally. When the psalmist says, "Let the trees of the woods clap their hands before the Lord," nobody thinks that he's teaching botany. Rather, the key to correctly interpreting the Bible is to discern the type of literature that you're reading. Now, the Bible contains a wide variety of different literary types: prophecy, history, epistle, poetry, apocalypse, and so on. And to read these indiscriminately in all the same way is going to lead to confusion. Now, when it comes to the Gospels, Bishop Spong variously classifies these, sometimes as mythology, as he did tonight, but sometimes as midrash, sometimes as legend, sometimes as theology, and so on. The problem is that these are all distinct literary types, different from one another. But Dr. Spong, rather like that fellow in the Florida orange juice commercial, just throws everything into the blender at once and comes up with a sort of literary mash. And this isn't apt to be very helpful, I think, in our understanding of the Gospels. Let me share with you then the thinking of contemporary scholarship concerning the literary type of the Gospels. Contemporary scholars have come to realize that the Gospel's literary type is not mythology or midrash, but rather it is ancient biography, like Plutarch's famous lives of illustrious Greeks and Romans. According to Craig Keener in his recent commentary on the Gospel of John, and I quote, "The Gospels present themselves as true accounts of Jesus' ministry. All four Gospels fit the genre of ancient biography, the life of a prominent person. Jewish Christian readers would have been most familiar with literary works concerning primary characters in terms of Hellenistic lives or ancient biographies." He concludes, "Arguments concerning the biographical character of the Gospels have thus come full circle. The Gospels, long viewed as biographies until the 20th century, now again are widely viewed as biographies." Moreover, Keener notes, ancient biographies were a form of historical writing. He says biographies were essentially historical works. Thus, the Gospels would have an essentially historical function. So a correct analysis of the Gospel's literary type shows that they are meant to be an account of what actually happened. Moreover, Keener notes two factors undergirding the reliability of these biographies. First, how close the Gospel sources are to the events that they narrate, and secondly, the Gospel's care in handing down the information in their sources. He concludes on the basis of these two factors that the Gospel should be placed among the most reliable of ancient biographies. So the bottom line then is that the Gospels are not mythology or midrash, rather they are ancient biography and pretty reliable ones at that. Now, Bishop Spong also says that should we think of the resurrection of Jesus as literal? Well, I think that question has been answered decisively by N.T. Wright in his recent book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. Wright does a study of how the word resurrection is used in ancient history, in paganism, in Judaism, in Christianity. And he concludes that there is no evidence for Jews of our period using the word resurrection to denote something essentially non-concrete. Raymond Brown agrees. He says it is not accurate to claim that the New Testament references to the resurrection of Jesus are ambiguous as to whether they meant bodily resurrection. There was no other kind of resurrection. So when early Christians said he is risen from the dead, they meant it literally and bodily. And thus you have Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 arguing with the Corinthians over the question, with what kind of body do they come? The sermons in the book of Acts portray the resurrection as a physical event witnessed by various people. And of course, the empty tomb itself is testimony that this was taken to be a literal event, leaving an empty tomb in its wake. But Bishop Spong has a third objection. He says, what about all the inconsistencies in the narratives? Well, as I said in my first speech, no historian just throws out a source because it has inconsistencies. Indeed, the very task of the critical historian is to sift his sources to distinguish the historical from the unhistorical. And so looking for inconsistencies is just too blunt a tool to be of much value in analyzing one's sources. It's like trying to do brain surgery with a machete. Moreover, the inconsistencies that Bishop Spong is talking about aren't within a single source. They're between independent sources. But obviously, it doesn't follow from an inconsistency between independent sources that both of the sources are wrong. At worst, it only follows that one is wrong if they cannot be harmonized. Now, I think that most of the inconsistencies he mentioned can be harmonized. There are all answers to all of these, but I don't have time in this speech, obviously, to deal with them. Let me simply point out that the gospel accounts are unanimous and harmonious in their historical core, which is what I'm arguing for tonight. The discrepancies occur in the secondary details. All four gospels agree on the following facts: that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in Jerusalem by Roman authority at the time of the Passover feast, having been arrested and convicted on charges of blasphemy by the Jewish Sanhedrin, and then slandered before the Roman governor Pilate on charges of treason. He died within a few hours and was buried Friday afternoon by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb, which was then sealed with a stone. Certain women followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, having observed his interment, visited his tomb early on Sunday morning, only to find it empty. Thereafter, Jesus appeared alive from the dead to the disciples, including Peter, who then became proclaimers of the message of his resurrection. Now, all four Gospels agree on those facts. Many more details could be added if you include, in addition to that, facts which are attested by 3 out of the 4. The historian Michael Grant concludes, true, the discovery of the empty tomb is narrated differently by the different Gospels. But if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. So I think we have good grounds for believing that the tomb was empty. What about the appearances? Well, here Bishop Spong asked, are they really physical? Isn't that a feature only of the later Gospels? Well, the case I presented doesn't depend on the nature of the appearances. It leaves it open whether they were visionary or physical. But let me say briefly why I do think they were physical. The claim that they only were physical in later Gospels assumes that these Gospels were written much later. But I think we have every reason to think that Acts was written prior to AD 62, and Luke's Gospel, therefore, sometime in the late AD 50s. That places it just as early as Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Secondly, there's no evidence whatsoever that physical appearances only came later. On the contrary, we have multiple independent attestation of physical appearances. Indeed, our sources are unanimous on this. Thirdly, if originally all the disciples saw were visions of Jesus, then it wouldn't have led to belief in his resurrection. At most, it would have led to belief in his exaltation to heaven, but not to his being raised from the dead. So I think we've got good grounds for affirming the appearances. Dr. Spong agrees with me that something big and powerful happened to bring about the origin of the disciples' belief. And he says we must affirm the reality of the resurrection, and we must affirm that it be available in every generation. But where my disagreement is, I think, is that Bishop Spong wants to retain the language of Christian theology while evacuating it of any literal significance. On Bishop Spong's view, Jesus wasn't literally raised from the dead. His corpse was thrown into a shallow dirt grave where it rotted away. Jesus is literally dead. So the words about Jesus being raised in the meaning of God and the resurrection being available to every generation really are in the end empty. It's just flowery phrases. It is the language of Christian theology, but without the literal content. And so my concern is that the power and life of the resurrection cannot be available to every generation unless this is a real event that actually happened rather than just mythology or a fairy tale. And therefore, I think it's critical that we affirm the historicity of the resurrection as a basis for our affirmation of its meaning.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. And now Bishop Spong for the rebuttal.
I have great admiration for a man who can quote Gerd Ludemann and Tom Wright in the same presentation. They represent sort of the extremes in biblical scholarship. Dr. Craig has used a trick. That's an incorrect word. He's used, what shall I say? He's done the same thing that politicians do. He says, everybody thinks of it my way. Most scholars, he said a number of times, do this. Most scholars do that. Well, he and I must read a totally different group of scholars. I'm a member of the Jesus Seminar. We have 250 PhD Bible scholars, Catholic and Protestant, and they would not agree at all with either the timing that Dr. Craig mentioned or with some of his historicity of such things as the tomb, the empty tomb. When you read biblical material, you're not always reading primary sources. We know for a fact that Matthew copied Mark into his gospel. Matthew copies about 90% of Mark into his gospel. We know that Luke also had Mark in front of him when he wrote, so Luke copies about half of Mark into his gospel. So when Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree, it's no mystery. They have the same source. Mark is the primary source for all of them. Let me suggest that our dating system would be quite different. Paul, in my dating scheme, would write between 50 and 64. I assume that you would agree probably with that. But when we get past that, I would date Mark after 70. I would date Matthew in the mid-80s. I would date Luke the late 80s, maybe even the early 90s. And I've never seen anybody that suggested that Acts was as early as Dr. Craig has suggested. Indeed, if you read people like Burton Mack, you'll find that he dates Acts way in the 2nd century. There's a great deal of debate about that. But it's interesting to me that the people who want to make sure that literal biblical content is believed always opt for the earlier and earlier dating processes, which I don't believe can be substantiated. The fact is that the Gospels are written sometime between 40 and 70 years after the earthly life of Jesus came to an end, and it was written in a language that Jesus didn't speak. So before you and I read our Bibles, the story of Jesus is lived in oral transmission for 40 to 70 years and has gone through one translation. All I want us to do is to keep open our minds to the possibility that the story might have grown in that transmission. Not the essential experience, but the way it is described. Please recognize there is a difference between an experience which is real and eternal and the way anybody explains that experience at any given moment in time. The explanation always warps it in time, always binds it in time. Let me also suggest that the idea that the Gospels are biography is an idea that I know of no one in the New Testament world that I associate with would agree. I think of the Gospels, at least the synoptics. I can't make a case for John, but the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. I would say that the underlying principle creating those is liturgy, not biography. Liturgy. He even suggested that everybody agrees that the crucifixion took place during the time of the Passover. I'm not sure everybody agrees with that at all. One of the earliest ways in which the Christ was interpreted was by Paul, who said, Christ is our new Passover. And you need to understand the Jewish Passover to understand what that claim was. It was an astonishing claim. In the Passover story, the angel of death passed over Jewish homes where the blood of the paschal lamb had been placed on the doorpost. So the blood of the paschal lamb was thought to have the power to dispel death. Paul says, Jesus is our new Passover. I think what lies behind that is that people were trying to process the Jesus experience. He died on the cross. They needed to make sense out of that. And so they likened it to the death of the paschal lamb. The cross became the doorpost of the world. The blood of the paschal lamb was shed on the cross. That blood has the power to overcome death. Those of us who come to God through that paschal lamb's self-offering can find eternal life. That's a powerful sermon that Paul was preaching. And I think that's probably what led them to see or to begin to place the crucifixion at the time of the Passover. A scholar at Birmingham University, where Dr. Craig got his doctorate, is named Michael Donald Goulder. Fascinating man, because he became an atheist late in his life, but he was a profound New Testament scholar. But Michael Goulder suggested that the primary thing that organizes the New Testament is the liturgical life of the synagogue, because the stories of Jesus were remembered and recalled in the synagogue. That's where they lived. The Christian movement didn't break away from the synagogue officially until 88 of this Common Era. So the Jesus narrative was lived in the synagogue. And as it was lived in the synagogue, it was constantly interpreted against synagogue worship. Have you ever wondered why Mark is the shortest gospel of the three? I think it's because Mark gives you Jesus stories that go from Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, to Passover, the first celebration of the Jewish year in the month of Nisan. And John the Baptist, who opens Mark's gospel, is very much a Rosh Hashanah figure. What happened at Rosh Hashanah? They blew the trumpet. They gathered the people. They said, prepare for the kingdom of God to come, which is the essential John the Baptist message. And then you drive that gospel all the way through. The Jews had a day called the Festival of Dedication. It came in the month of Kislev, our month of December. We tend to call it Hanukkah. But in the Festival of Dedication, they celebrated the light of God being restored to the temple, the true worship of God being restored. It comes out of the Maccabean period of Jewish history. It's interesting to me that exactly at that point in Mark's gospel, he tells the story of the transfiguration of Jesus, the light of God coming down upon Jesus, who is the new temple, the new meeting place between God and human life. And the idea that Jesus is the new temple gets picked up in the later Gospels when Jesus is quoted as saying, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will build it up. And they didn't understand, says the Gospel writer, because he was referring to the temple of his own body. The only way that I believe that they could have seen Jesus as the new temple was that they lived in a world where the temple had been destroyed, which happened in the year 70 AD in the Great Roman War. So I see Jesus being interpreted liturgically against the background of the Jewish worship cycle, and that's the organizing principle. The reason Matthew and Luke had to expand Mark was that they wanted to have Christian readings for all of the Sabbaths of the year. And Mark only provided about 6.5 months. So Matthew and Luke both stretched Mark. Matthew stretched it in a very Jewish direction. Luke stretched it in a much more Gentile direction. I think if we can begin to develop liturgical eyes, to begin to read our narratives, we will begin to see so much more. One of the reasons that I don't think we've been able as Christians to look at the Bible as that which grew, look at the Gospels as that which grew out of the synagogue worship tradition, is that we have been frankly anti-Semitic throughout our history. When I was a Sunday school boy, going to my evangelical Sunday school in Charlotte, North Carolina, I never met a good Jew in my Sunday school material. They were all evil people. They were sinister. They were out to get Jesus, or they were out to get Paul. Nobody ever told me that Jesus was a Jew. That sort of escaped notice. Oh, I knew that Judas Iscariot was a Jew. I knew that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were Jews, and the chief priests were Jews. The scribes, they were Jews. But nobody ever told me that Jesus was a Jew, and that Paul was a Jew, and that Mary and Joseph were Jews, and Mary Magdalene was a Jew, and all of the disciples were Jews, because they were good people. It was given to me as good Christians against bad Jews. Well, I think we've got to begin to open our eyes and to recognize that this Jewish Jesus was interpreted first within a Jewish frame of reference. And then when we left that frame of reference, we lost a lot of our understanding. One final note before I finish. You've heard many a time, I'm sure, Jesus died for my sins. It's a mantra among Christians. You ever wonder where it comes from? The Jews had a day called Yom Kippur. where they killed a lamb who was perfect mentally, morally, and physically. And then they took the blood of this lamb who stood between them and God, because they weren't aware, they weren't capable of standing in that place close to God, and they sprinkled the blood of this lamb on the people so that they were washed in the blood of the lamb, cleansed from their sins, and restored to God. That was a Jewish worship tradition, and it has deep echoes in the Christian tradition, and I think we miss them because we cannot read the Bible with Jewish eyes.
Thank you very much, Bishop Spong. We have now concluded the first part of this debate, and I want to thank our two participants. We're going to take a break for about 8 minutes, so please don't go and have a backyard picnic or something. We will come back and we will have the rebuttal of the rebuttal, as it might be called, by both debaters, and then there will be a time of questions that will be entertained to each of the debaters from the studio audience and from the television audience. So please come back in about 7 or 8 minutes. Thank you.